I'm Robert McNeil. Welcome to a special program for America at a Crossroads.
It's Iraq and Afghanistan that make all the headlines. But quietly, under the media radar, the American military is also undertaking scores of small footprint missions in places like Georgia, Mali, Colombia, and the Philippines, where the goal is to protect America's interests. Robert Kaplan believes that America, despite the problems in Iraq, is now effectively an empire.
Funding for America at a Crossroads was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Americans don't usually think of themselves as imperialists. The very word sounds like a hangover from Soviet propaganda. Yet today, the U.S. maintains a global military presence suggestive of empire. Our daily attention is focused on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Less obvious, because less often seen on the news, American troops are serving in dozens of other countries. It's the thesis of this report that they mark the frontiers of an American empire, not as colonial occupiers, but as outriders of democracy and help against terrorism. Author Robert Kaplan believes that such small-scale gestures can prevent future massive wars like Iraq. Years ago, Winston Churchill warned, empires of the future will be empires of the mind. But in this tour of American outposts on 4 continents, Robert Kaplan argues the American empire still needs boots on the ground.
In the first decades of America's life, an ambitious Frenchman, Pierre l'Enfant, designed a capital for the fledgling nation. And he did it on an imperial scale. His design may have seemed grandiose once, but America grew to fit the vision. Today, the United States is an economic and cultural giant, and it has a military to match. Latest figures show the Pentagon owns or rents over 700 bases in 130 nations. It conducts military operations in dozens of countries every year. Robert Kaplan believes that America, despite the problems in Iraq, is now effectively an empire. As a reporter for the Atlantic Monthly and author of 11 books, he has seen this empire develop firsthand, and his thoughts about it are listened to in the highest echelons of government.
The word empire makes people's skin crawl. They immediately associate it with colonialism, oppression, etc. But the fact is the United States is now in an imperial-like situation around the world because of the kind of deployments we have. What they're doing, where they are, is the only valid historical comparisons are with previous empires from the past.
As most Americans focus on continuing military action in Iraq and Afghanistan, Robert Kaplan in this film travels to 4 outposts which normally get little attention. Places where the U.S. military is undertaking low-key missions, which Kaplan believes offer a viable alternative to Iraq-style invasions. Each illustrates how the U.S. military is attempting to promote America's interests by trying to build security in key regions of the world. He visits Georgia in Eastern Europe, where the collapse of the Soviet Union has set off small wars on its border with Russia. He visits Colombia, where a volatile mix of guerrilla wars and drug trafficking for years has threatened stability on America's doorstep. But first, he visits Mali in West Africa and the Philippines in Southeast Asia, which, since 9/11, have attracted heightened interest because of the war against global terrorism launched by President Bush. Zamboanga in the southern Philippines. It's poor, undeveloped, and little touched by the hand of government. While the northern Philippines has been Catholic since Spanish colonists arrived in the 16th century, the south of the country has long been mainly Muslim. For hundreds of years, on and off, insurgents among the Muslim population here, alienated from and sometimes persecuted by the Catholic-dominated government in Manila, have waged a war for independence. But in the 1990s, with the rise of fundamentalist Islam, there emerged here a new and more radical Islamic group called Abu Sayyaf. It combined local insurgency campaigns like this bomb attack in Zamboanga in 2002 with links to international Islamist terrorism. Its elusive figurehead and founder, Abdur-Jakjan Jalani, trained in terrorist camps in Afghanistan. Another link to the group, Ramzi Youssef, was convicted of organizing the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Another was caught with plans to use jetliners to crash into prominent buildings in Washington and New York.
This is an area not just of local Islamic terrorism, but of terrorism central to 9/11, because the planning for a number of terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington that ultimately were not carried out, but which were planned in the mid-90s, occurred in the Philippines. And there has been a direct Philippine connection, not an indirect one, to 9/11 and a lot of the most spectacular world terrorist attacks.
Now, the focus of all this has moved to Jolo, an isolated, largely Muslim island at the southern tip of the country, where the Abu Sayyaf group is holed up. With American help, the Philippine Army has mounted an innovative campaign to flush them out. In charge of the American mission is an Army Special Forces Colonel, Jim Linder.
We have a mission. Our mission is to move into Jolo and reduce the recruiting ground and sanctuary for terrorism. This is an extremely dangerous environment. It's combat in every way. We are not on the front page of the New York Times, but I will tell you this, we will take casualties. It will happen, and I don't want people to be surprised by it.
Literally an hour since we've arrived, there have already been casualties from armed forces of the Philippine attack on an Abu Sayyaf guerrilla group base that occurred last night. They're bringing in casualties now from the firefight. You know, one point that should be made clear, this is the armed forces of the Philippines fighting, not the American army. The American Special Forces are here to assist the armed forces of the Philippines, but not to fight alongside them.
When the first U.S. troops arrived in 2002 as part of America's global strategy to wage war on Islamic terrorism, small crowds took to the streets, some to welcome them, others protesting at foreign intervention. To reassure the population that their own troops, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, or AFP, were still in charge, the Filipino government limited the 300 Special Forces soldiers to an advisory role.
It's really a very small complement of U.S. Special Forces that you see today. Predominantly what you've seen is a lot of AFP forces that provide the security as we move around through the area, because genuinely we're here to support them. We've been fortunate because we haven't had any U.S. casualties out here. But I guess what you saw today is exactly what we're experiencing. It's a very violent area, very violent culture. We categorize this as a Charlie Plus. which is just short of Force Protection Posture Delta, which means attack is imminent.
None of this is really new. It's actually a return to where the American empire began. In 1898, at the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States, seeking a power base in the Pacific, sent troops to occupy the Philippines. The islands proved strategically invaluable during two world wars and the Cold War, and have been the site of permanent U.S. bases until the 1990s. The original American occupation ignited a long-standing struggle between the Muslim population and Manila. A full-scale guerrilla war erupted between American troops and the local Muslim insurgents, resentful of central rule.
The counterinsurgency lessons that were learned in the Philippines 100 years ago were forgotten in many places. They were not applied in Vietnam, but they're being applied now. And they're age-old lessons. And the most important is, if you're a young major or a young captain somewhere on this island or nearby, your task is to separate the population from the insurgents.
It is on the neighboring island of Basilan that the tactic has been reapplied. Basilan used to be an Abu Sayyaf stronghold, but a series of U.S. and Filipino military civilian projects, from well digging to road building, has brought in money and jobs, satisfying some of the local grievances against Manila. The insurgents lost support among the local population and were forced to scatter.
Well, I was last here in the summer of 2003, 2.5 years ago, and now there are a whole bunch of items that I can tick off that are better. I can turn on my cell phone and get a full bar connection where there was none a few and a half years ago. I'm going to just open my phone, start it to see if I can get reception. I got all the bars straight up, perfect reception. There are just all concretized roads that I remember didn't exist before. The streets are more crowded. I have seen chain restaurants, local Filipino chain restaurants that did not exist before.
The significance of Jollibee in Basilan is enormous in the sense that its presence here signifies the incoming development and progress of the place. It will also signals the other businesses to come over to Basilan and put up business here.
Kaplan accompanies Colonel Lindu, who has been invited to address a meeting of Basilan's Muslims and Christians.
When I first came to the Philippines, I went around and I asked, how do we go about and change the dynamics of an environment so we can be peace and order where there is lawlessness? And to the man, every single one of them told me, go to Basilan. Go there and see what they did, because that is the model to replicate. And I am here as a commander of the American forces, not to bring war, but to wage peace.
It means that the peace and order situation are getting better. So services like health services can be seen in far-flung areas. As you can see, the roads here are getting better. And when I go home, so the roads now are cemented. Because of this, lives are improving.
Probably the best sign of progress is that this island is no longer the center of the action. The center of the action has moved on further south to Jolo, which nobody 2.5 years ago thought there was even any chance of trying to get in on. The basic attitude then was put a fence around Jolo, throw meat over the side 2 or 3 times a day and let it be.
Back on Jolo, the Army Special Forces unit is trying to replicate what has been achieved on Basilan.
All right, can everybody's attention, please? All right, welcome aboard, MBLT 5, Marine Battalion Landing Team 5. Okay, location we're going to is a daycare center. Enemy situations, Abu Sayyaf group, ties to international terrorism. They have a presence here in this area, in particular up in these mountains. That's why we roll around in full kit, and level 4 in order to present a hard target to the enemy, all right? With this hard exterior, there's a softer side. So my guidance is one hand on the pistol grip, other hand waves, all right? That way, again, it shows the people that we care and that we're not here just being a bunch of bullies rolling through the area, all right?
This is the plan of action for places like Basilan and Jolo. Civil and medical action programs designed to bring in responsible government where none exists.
This is a different kind of warfare. It's not about maneuver warfare. It's not about compelling the enemy. It's not about seizing the other guy's capital.
Thank you very much. Thanks for volunteering today. Thank you.
It's a very counterintuitive environment in many ways. If we are attacked, my reaction is not to go into a fortress. My reaction is to get out of the fortress. This is a people business we're in. In order for us to come out here and help these people make better decisions, in order to come out here and assess what their true needs are, you have to come out here and you'll have to live with them.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. Ladies, how are you? It's great to see you again.
Abu Sayyaf has support here through family and religious ties, and because they oppose what many here see as a corrupt and repressive regime in Manila. But they also exert control through fear, running extortion and kidnapping operations to fund the bombing campaigns. The hope is that the military presence will enable good government to operate and build trust among the local population.
So they're afraid of low-level kidnappings and banditry and violence. And the American public is afraid of big-time terrorist attacks, but there's a link.
Oh, yes, yes. They mentioned to you that the first bomber of the World Trade Center, Ramzi Youssef.
He had a Philippine connection. He was based in the Philippines.
He trained the guerrillas here.
Should we take any contact, we think it'd be from that side. Just ask if you guys could please get down inside the vehicle so the guy in the gun can do his work as needed with any identified targets that are an identified threat.
Yeah.
A short drive from the village is a former terrorist camp.
Now, before we were talking about Ramzi Youssef.
Yes.
Was this the place where he was?
Yes, he was conducting training on explosives and guerrilla warfare. The original Janjalani, Abdurrajak Janjalani, who came from Afghanistan, this is his turf.
So Abdullah Janjalani from Afghanistan was here, who was trained in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Ramzi Youssef was here, who planned the original World Trade Center bombings, right in this, right where we're standing.
Yeah, they were all here conducting training. It's a playground for them. It's a perfect haven for terrorists.
But there is a limit to how quickly Army Special Forces missions like this one can turn things around. Opposition to the military presence on the island is strong.
Regretfully, it looks like we have first report of 4 killed and 14 wounded. They're all civilians. The bomb went off in a grocery store, and we don't have complete clarity because we just got their initial report.
So you weren't kidding when the other day you said this really is a war zone.
Very much a war zone, Robert.
The bomb went off a couple of miles from one of the bases Kaplan visited 24 hours earlier. The precarious security situation is the main reason why it has to be the U.S. military, rather than civil development and aid institutions that take the lead here. Yet the fact that American forces are caught up in a real war in the Philippines prompts tough questions about the validity and nature of U.S. military involvement in distant regions of the world.
Are we being busybodies? Are we being overextended? Are we just getting involved in too many places that we can't handle? Here's the answer. What other alternative is there? On the one hand, we could be total isolationists, not get involved anywhere, but that would be irresponsible. And on the other hand, we could let problems build up and fester to a point where every once in a while we'd have to invade with a large number of infantry and we'd have more Iraqs. So the real answer to avoiding future Iraqs is not to be involved in less places, but more.
One aspect of empire building is surprising. Throughout history, military empires built security in their distant outposts by cooperating with, rather than dominating, elements of the host country.
The essence of empire is not fighting, it's not conquering, it's training indigenous forces to project power on their own, in their own interest, but also in your interest. And this has a total connection with the past because most of the operations carried out in the name of the British and the French Empire were carried out by native indigenous forces with British or French or other advisors. So the idea of the combat advisor embracing his indigenous brother is straight out of imperial history.
And that is exactly what is going on in a distant corner of Mali in West Africa, where the U.S. military, as part of America's global war on terror, is trying to stop Islamic militancy from taking root.
Every country, no matter how obscure, can become really important in a crisis because we're fighting a worldwide counterinsurgency, and Al-Qaeda thrives in weakly governed areas where they have cultural access afforded by an Islamic setting. And you have all of that in Mali.
A unit of American Army Special Forces soldiers is on the edge of the Sahara Desert. They're here because the U.S. military wants to counter a threat to security in the region. To the north of Mali is Algeria, a country which has spawned Islamic militants. A quarter of all foreign fighters caught in Iraq are from North Africa. The U.S. military thinks sub-Saharan Africa may be ripe for penetration by Al-Qaeda and its offshoots. It's why special forces are working with Malian troops, training them in techniques to secure Mali's borders and control its vast desert territory. Because it's a low-key mission built on mutual cooperation, there are few objections to the American presence.
All right, we got the sights out, we're ready to go.
There's a Army Special Forces motto, by, through, and with the Indigs. By, through, and with indigenous forces. It's all about building relationships.
The 12-man Army Special Forces team is based in Timbuktu, the fabled desert town that for centuries has acted as an outpost on the edge of the untamed Sahara. Under the French, this region was dotted with colonial forts to subdue local tribes. For Kaplan, the Special Forces base in Timbuktu resonates with historical parallels.
If you look at the design on the railing here, this could be French Foreign Legion, the 19th century. And I might add, it's also not very much different from the forts in the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain West in the second half of the 19th century when the United States Army fought a small unit, high-speed maneuver, counterinsurgency against the North American Indian tribes. And that's why the U.S. Army refers to it as Indian country, or Indian country. It's meant as no slight against the Indians. It's just that the irregular guerrilla-like wars in the mid-19th century in North America are operationally and tactically far more similar to the worldwide counterinsurgency the military is facing now against Al-Qaeda than World War I and World War II combined.
And like his French predecessor 100 or more years ago, the American commander here, Captain Torre, knows that his mission is all about relationships with the local population.
We're not here in an over defensive posture. We don't want to present that, but at the same time we don't want to ever be unprepared. So we don't stack these up on the outside where they're obvious, but for protection we do stack them up on the inside. It's hard to look back and think of how I essentially made the best decision that I've ever made. This is the mission that I want to do. To operate as a small unit and really go in not with the brute force of the military, but with an understanding of the culture, an understanding of the language, and to work with local or indigenous forces.
What's really being created is a kind of a warrior diplomat, a chameleon of sorts. Someone who could be a diplomat in the morning, a humanitarian relief worker in the afternoon, and a direct action kinetic operations fighter in the evening. So they have to be able to know how to kill in one instance and love the people on the other.
And what these warrior diplomats need most is information.
We're leaving Timbuktu into an area where we really don't know much about. You know, despite this whole global information age, there's the illusion of knowledge where none actually exists. We're going to a town called Erawan, which is several hundred kilometers north into the utter desert towards the Algerian border in the center of the Sahara. We have no idea whether there have been, strangers, threatening strangers coming through the town. None of this information is available unless you actually go there and spend the night and talk to people there.
The Sahara has been a crossing point for nomads, as well as smugglers and bandits for hundreds of years. The fear is that hidden among the cross-Sahara traffic are insurgent cells linked to Al-Qaeda.
They're packing 9mm, a few M4 assault rifles, because again, it's Indian country. You don't know what you're going to encounter out there. We've just arrived in Erawan, which is sort of like a huddle of ruins on a bleached khaki moonscape. There's not a tree in the distance. It's sort of like the moon with oxygen on it. There's no sign, hand of government of any kind whatsoever. And the most important thing to do at this stage is not to go in bristling with guns, but to simply make contacts, get to know people. Sometimes you can make the best headway just by drinking a lot of tea, just talking and getting to know villagers and tribal headmen. Think of this as a dry land sea, as a vast sandy sea with movements of people where you have a tyranny of distance, because there are too few landscape features to funnel set routes of communication. What all that means is you conquer the tyranny of distance by relationships. You build up relationships.
In Erawan, Captain Torrey and his team hope to do that by helping to provide some basic services like eyeglasses. For the cost of one F-22 jet fighter, the U.S. military can sprinkle Africa with such small footprint missions.
It's just amazing how something this simple can go so far in a place like this. It's really amazing. They'll come in right here into the same room, which is their classroom. They'll actually be able to see that board. This is the best thing we've done this whole trip.
And, as in the Philippines, it's through building a friendly presence like this that the U.S. military hopes to develop crucial sources of intelligence in the global war on terror. To the north of Mali is Algeria. Some 200,000 have been killed in a bloody civil war sparked in 1992, when Islamists who wanted an Islamic state won the first round in parliamentary elections. The army nullified the vote and banned Islamist parties. This triggered a bloody insurgency. Chased out by the Algerian authorities, some of the armed Islamic groups have crossed into Mali to take refuge in the vast, uncharted Sahara.
In 2002, we were in a shootout with Algerian Islamists. There were about 100 of them. It began at 6 in the morning and finished at 11. When it was over, they had 7 dead and 3 injured. And we had 1 dead and 1 injured.
Captain Torrey And City, who's one of the sergeants in the team, they were interested in, is there a landing strip? Is there a well? Who's been passing through the area? They want a sense of the movement of traffic through the region, because you cannot separate the strands between simple, normal banditry on one hand and what might be terrorism on the other.
For the officer in charge, it's a classic example of how a military and diplomatic Army Special Forces mission, making financial and aid donations in remote outposts, can build relationships across an entire region.
In the grand scheme of things, we didn't accomplish much besides drinking tea, if you want to look for a quantifiable result. But the intangibles are what's the most important. The relationships that we've developed here, the ability for us to come back and have them remember this experience. Somebody's going to donate here. Somebody is going to identify this place as a place where donations are needed. Maybe it's someone that we don't want to have influence here, someone who has ill intentions. We need to be providing more support, and that equates to more dollars here than our adversaries.
But America's military empire has been about more than combating terrorism. U.S. troops have also been sent to stabilize countries racked by insurrection and criminality, instability that also threatens America.
You cannot have liberty without authority, because if there's no authority, there's no liberty for anyone. If there's no functioning police force, if there's no functioning army or law courts, nobody is willing to get out of bed in the morning. Human progress has happened, has been speeded up when you've had strong central government. Of course, you don't want government to be so strong and centralized that it becomes oppressive. So the point is to have a happy medium, to have stable governments that can project their power throughout their territory in as least oppressive a way as possible.
And that's a mission the U.S. military undertook long before 9/11, when it was involved in another war in which armed groups had unleashed an intractable insurgency in an oil-rich region on America's doorstep. It was called the War on Drugs. For 40 years, Colombia has been subjected to terror, bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations, carried out by guerrilla groups opposed to a government whose response was often just as brutal. They have been predominantly left-wing, though their Marxist ideology long ago gave way to the most ruthless for-profit killing. What the groups all have in common is that they are funded by cocaine, 80% of which ends up in America. To fight the war, successive U.S. presidents have sent billions of dollars of American aid and U.S. military trainers into the heart of the conflict. They called it the War on Drugs, but, like the War on Terror, it was really about using U.S. military power to try and neutralize a danger that threatened the homeland.
The goal here is to help and facilitate the Colombian Army, Colombian government. You only have a few certain specialists here and there. Yeah, you can be effective to a certain extent, but the more people you have with that skill set, it's just a matter of helping them facilitate to get, multiply them. It exponentially grows their ability and their efforts to fight the war on narco-terrorism.
Just last week, the Colombian troops you're seeing right behind me lost a man in action. This is a Colombian Special Forces unit that goes out on missions constantly. It could even be taken away from this training to go out on a mission. There's nothing abstract or theoretical about this. This is a combat unit. This is real. And what they're doing now may save their lives.
This is what the Colombian and U.S. forces are up against: the sophisticated weaponry of armed groups financed by cocaine profits.
It is a conflict. They don't fight with machetes or knives. They are well equipped with powerful weapons and can sustain combat.
You really see the extent of the fighting here, that this has been a real combat zone.
It's because the security situation is so precarious that it's the Colombian army, backed by the U.S. military, that is taking the lead in bringing social aid programs to places like this poor community on the outskirts of Medellin.
This is a real extravaganza. I mean, basically what we're seeing is one of the most dangerous neighborhoods of Medellin. A few years ago, we couldn't be in here. You'd have 2 or 3 paramilitary drug armies contesting the area. You'd have express kidnappings where they'd kidnap somebody. If they didn't get the money in 2 hours, they'd be killed. Now you have the kind of medical civil action program here with the military providing security that we've seen in the Philippines, Mali, and other places. It's all about context. I mean, the U.S. military has a very sensitive history in Latin America, by no means all positive. But if you just have a very small number of U.S. troops and they're associated with something like a medical civil action program, then it has a good connotation and people see it as a good thing.
Bringing social aid into the neglected parts of Colombia's cities is one thing, but the military's major challenge is securing vast tracts of jungle where Colombia's drug armies hold sway.
Colombia, you fly around. There are very few parts of the country, in terms of generally, where you can drive long distances. This is a country that's linked by planes, by airplanes, because you have ungovernable spaces controlled by drug armies.
And that's the challenge faced by the Colombian government and U.S. advisors.
What's down there is just desolation and isolation. You see how hard it is for the government to control just from looking at it. In a way, this is the flip side of the Malian desert. Same degree of isolation and hard for a central government to control. Here we have narco-terrorists. But it's the same challenge, how the U.S. military can help local indigenous forces to make a country that has never really been a country into a country.
This is Peñas Coloradas, on the edge of the Colombian Amazon. It exemplifies the problems faced by places like Colombia, where the government lacks the resources to control vast and isolated areas of land. This area used to be under the control of the FARC, a populist left-wing armed guerrilla movement with widespread support among Colombia's landless peasants. Funded by cocaine bandits under their control, FARC ran the area as a state within a state. Now, the Colombian army, with logistical support from the Americans, has retaken the area.
This place really does look like a sprawling medieval castellated fort made out of green sandbags and light medium machine guns, kind of.
Yeah. This is an airstrip right here, and this was the coca center of all of the Caguan. Everything that was produced in the Caguan area was brought here and then shipped out.
And they counted the money by weighing the $100 bills, because there were so many of them.
Yeah, just so much that they didn't even bother counting, just the weight. The Raspatinas, or the guys who grew the coca, they bring it here. They give them all the money for it. Then they spend it. They spend it here with, on alcohol and women.
Alcohol and women in the middle of this vastness, kind of.
Yeah.
Like the Old West.
Yeah, it sounds like the Old West.
The Old West.
So 2 years ago this month, the Colombian army took back this town.
No, that is correct.
What did they find? Were these houses abandoned by then, or were people living in them?
Yeah, when the troops were out coming in from the outside going in, the FARC ordered everybody to leave. Yeah, it was all catered to the people. They're bringing in the coca from their farms and stuff. Places to stay, places to gamble, places to just spend money. Yeah, they have discotheques all over the place. They were able to use the telephone even. It's amazing all the stuff that they had here. It's all gone.
It's like a gold rush town, except instead of gold, it was cocaine.
Right.
Well, we've seen a fast buck tropical lowland town of prostitution and booze and cash of such large amounts that the $100 bills had to be weighed in order to count them. And we've also seen sadness. We've seen houses that were deserted in the spur of the moment. But again, what are the alternatives here? This action was prosecuted by a democratically elected government because what was going on here, it was an organized crime factory of billions of dollars, and yet there's no sign of any real infrastructure ever being built for the benefit of the citizenry. There is no victory here, totally, but what is the alternative but constant suppression, constant pressure, constant effort? Victory goes to those with constancy.
Groups like the FARC are vehemently opposed to American involvement in their country. They reject the idea that America should be playing the role of the world's policeman.
If you don't have a U.S. military diplomatic footprint over large corners of the earth, somebody will replace it. Well, would you rather have that to be the authoritarian Chinese, or you would have that to be the thuggish, authoritarian, reconstituted Russian Empire? It can't be the Europeans because they're not putting in the defense budgets, the military budgets to do that kind of thing. The UN, as we've seen, is a great idea in the abstract, but look at its record in Bosnia, Rwanda, in southern Lebanon, and many other places we could name. There is no alternative to United States' great power presence around the earth at this moment in history.
One of the places where the United States has a new military presence is in one of the most politically sensitive areas of the world.
We've just arrived in Georgia, in the heart of the Caucasus. We have Iran to the south, Russia to the north. This is a country that's always been invaded by big empires, the Persian Empire to the south, the Tsarist and Soviet empires to the north. Its borders have never been secure. Where we are now is really on the tectonic plates between where the Middle East crashes up against Europe and against Russia and Eurasia.
This is a former Soviet military base on the outskirts of Tbilisi. 20 years ago, an American military presence in such a place would have been unthinkable. In 1991, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Georgia declared independence. Russia, annoyed by its loss of influence, unleashed small wars along the border. Georgia looked to America for support, and America was happy to step in. The U.S. saw it as an opportunity to extend its influence in the oil-rich regions of Central Asia and act as a bulwark against Russia and Iran.
The smell, it's an indefinable smell, reminds me of Turkmenistan, Romania, Bulgaria, the whole ex-Soviet Union, the southern tier, and former Warsaw Pact countries. There's a kind of communist-style development that's brutal and cruddy at the same time. I mean, if you really want to see the change in history, from one empire to another, rather than go anywhere in the Middle East or in Asia, just travel the shadow zones of the ex-Soviet empire. You will see American military training groups everywhere and bases around here.
A small force of U.S. Marines is training local troops. Georgia is one of a number of fledgling democracies in the region that receives American help. The Americans are popular here. A new big brother to underpin Georgia's newfound independence and protect it from its powerful Russian neighbor to the north.
Yeah, we're trying to help them because their military was lacking, and they needed help. The vacuum kind of with the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, they weren't getting any help, and the resources were limited. So we kind of decided in 2002 to send in some trainers and help them basically begin their military all over again.
Put this here. We'll make you work about All right, now tell them to act their part once we tell them where to go, okay?
These are the practicalities of retraining a military, replacing the rules of an old military empire with those of the new.
It seems like a lot of times if it's maybe their leadership style coming from Eastern Europe, that like one person ran the show and everybody else is waiting for direction.
Make sure you get your immediates now, quickly.
We're trying to teach them that if their senior people get knocked out, we want to make sure someone can step up to the plate and continue running, fulfilling the mission.
We got a bomb! We need more casualties. I need 3 people down here right now. 3 dead patients right now. 3 patients. Oh, you're dead.
It's going pretty good. We're causing them a lot of chaos for them. So they got the patients in here. We're going to make sure that they're tracking the patients right. That's our biggest challenge now.
So what do you all think of the American military presence in Georgia? Do you think it's a good thing?
Yes, of course.
It's a Russian expression, kind of, if you want peace, you should be prepared for war.
But there are areas of the region where the American military presence in Georgia hasn't been so welcome. Since Georgian independence, a trail of disorder has been unleashed on its borders with Russia. 2 Russian-backed regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, want to break away from Georgia and have close ties with Russia. Georgia, backed by the U.S., wants to hang on to them.
Georgia has always been part of Russia's near abroad. So Russia's always had a tremendous interest here. And so has to be suspicious of the U.S. military here.
Right after they declared independence in the early 90s, the whole country was about to fall apart. And the Georgians managed to hold on to everything except for Abkhazia and Ossetia, and each one broke off. The current situation in Ossetia is that you've got Russian, Georgian, and Ossetian peacekeepers all along the border here, where the bulk of the population is. And it's kind of a tense situation. It actually flared up last summer where they were shooting rounds at each other, lobbing mortars, things like that. But there's always issues.
Kaplan wants to get a sense of how Russia is reacting to an independent Georgia and the presence of U.S. troops in its backyard.
Well, we're leaving the base where the Americans are training the Georgians. We're going to go west to Gori, Stalin's birthplace, and then north into South Ossetia. There have been incidents along the borders with abductions, with mortar firing, not just on this border, and others too. And over the years in Adjaria, Abkhazia. So what the United States is trying to do now is somewhat rare in history, to train the Georgian military to defend borders that have never been defensible. It's unclear what there is ahead. When I was last here, there was no border, just a lot of places selling bootleg cigarettes and petrol, which signaled that you had left Georgia and entered the Russian Federation, or what the Russians claimed to be perhaps part of their federation. And this, of course, is the problem, because there is no border. The Russians can flood the Georgian economy with bootleg fuel, bootleg cigarettes. They've been doing this to undermine the Georgian economy. Our American Marine friends and guides, who we've been staying with for the last few days, cannot come with us here. Because right now, technically, we're in an internationally disputed area. Man seemed to let us pass, bearing an AK-47. All right, we've just left the Georgian checkpoints behind. Ossetia's ahead.
problem or no problem? Georgia. No, just let him do what he's going to do.
This is where we were picked up by police of some sort. It looked like there were several levels of police. 7 years ago I came through here. There was no border controls, nothing, just chaos and a lot of smuggling. This time there was a real rundown border shack. They took us, they passed us on to someone else, We wound up in a room in some ministry. They confiscated all of our equipment. They returned all of the equipment except for one cell phone, which they apparently stole. And here we are back again. And what this shows is that the Russians have basically reestablished their empire and borders of sorts with a kind of criminal border regime. And so the Russian Empire is back on the border with Georgia because it wasn't 7 years ago. And there's some semblance of order mixed with criminality.
Back in Tbilisi, Kaplan reflects on the dangers of the U.S. presence in the region.
So we're producing a product here, a better equipped, better trained Georgian army. And so the question remains, what will it do? Because once you go out and get involved in the world, you're also subjecting yourself to the rest of the world's anxieties. So Georgia is really still on the frontier of many empires and ambitions, Iranian, Russian, and now we are deeply involved.
It's Iraq and Afghanistan that make all the headlines. But quietly, under the media radar, the American military is also undertaking scores of small footprint missions in places like Georgia, Mali, Colombia, and the Philippines, where the goal is to protect America's interests. Kaplan ended his journey in a place that demonstrates the opportunities, but also the cost of involvement in these distant outposts.
Well, this may look like Arlington Cemetery, but it's really an American war cemetery in the Philippine Islands. There's been a lot of blood spilt here in the course of the decades. We just can't pull out of this place. We've helped usher it from military dictatorship to democracy. And if you look all over the world, what are the choices? Isolationism on one hand, invading Iraq on the other with mass infantry formations. What we've seen, as imperfect as it is, seems to me the only pragmatic, middle-of-the-road choice that Americans can support. So if you're against this, tell me, what are you for? Are you for isolationism? Okay. Are you for mass infantry invasions every decade or so? Okay, what I'm saying is this or a variation of this is the only practical alternative, as imperfect as we've seen.
Find interactive maps, discussion guides, and more about America at a Crossroads at pbs.org. Funding for America at a Crossroads was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. To order this episode of America at a Crossroads or other programs from the series on DVD, call 1-800-PLAY-PBS.